Do you have additional documentation? Brennan asked, though the paperwork in Elias's hand was complete and in order. The request wasn't standard. It was a stall, a challenge disguised as a question. Elias Thorne, CEO of a rising tech firm, remained calm. His purpose was simple: to open a new line of credit to fuel his company's expansion. A routine transaction, nothing unusual, nothing complicated. But Brennan didn't see a client. He saw something else. His gaze lingered on Elias in a way that didn't need words. It wasn't curiosity, it was quiet disbelief. From a nearby desk, a low voice drifted across the room. "Betty's just talking big," someone whispered, followed by a quiet laugh. Another staff member glanced over, then quickly turned back to her screen, smirking as if she had just confirmed what she already thought. What Brennan didn't know was that the man standing in front of him had the power to end his career in an instant. Brennan adjusted his tie, pretending to review Elias's documents again. "I'll also need to see proof of your company's annual revenue," he said, though that wasn't required at this stage. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried an unspoken challenge, as if Elias's success needed to be double-checked. Elias provided the revenue statement without protest. Brennan's eyes flicked over it, yet his hesitation remained. "Actually, do you have any verification of your ownership? Something beyond this?" Elias produced his shareholder certificate. It was as if every answer created another question. "Any confirmation from your legal counsel?" Brennan pressed. For a routine credit inquiry, these demands made no sense. They weren't listed anywhere in the bank's policy. The questions weren't about due diligence. They were about disbelief. It wasn't loud. It wasn't direct. But it was sharp enough to cut. Elias had faced this before. Each time he stepped into boardrooms, into banks, into rooms where his face wasn't expected, the rules subtly changed. Brennan continued flipping through the documents, searching for a reason to delay. His eyes lingered on Elias's identification, as though a title and credentials weren't enough. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with a quiet weight of doubt. Elias had come prepared, as he always did. He knew that preparation was not optional for men like him. In spaces like these, being excellent was a starting point, not the finish line. Brennan's next words landed like yet another brick in a long, familiar wall. "Do you have any secondary identification? Perhaps a letter from your bank's attorney?" Secondary identification? For a basic credit discussion? Elias provided it anyway. The requests kept coming, each one a quiet dismissal of what was already clear. These were the small acts that didn't make headlines, but they left marks. Nearby, two junior staff members whispered. "People like that always try to act important," one muttered, as if success belonged to others. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a quiet reminder, a message Elias had heard many times before, that his place was always in question. The cost of proving yourself over and over wasn't just time. It was a slow erosion of patience, the tightening in the chest that never fully leaves. Elias understood the quiet rules of this space. He had grown familiar with the extra hurdles placed before him, not because of a missing signature, not because of unclear policy, but because of who he was. In meetings, in elevators, in negotiations, it showed up in the same ways. His qualifications were questioned. His authority was challenged. His decisions were double-checked. These weren't loud accusations. They were quiet tests, 4 steps that others walked past without notice. Sometimes it came as a surprise glance when he introduced himself as the founder. Sometimes it arrived as disbelief when he named the size of his company. Other times, it appeared as delays, sudden concerns, or shifting requirements that seemed to only apply to him. Each instance chipped away at something far deeper than patience. It pressed against his sense of belonging, forcing him to carry a weight that never seemed to lift. For Black professionals like Elias, these repeated challenges form a pattern. Being mistaken for someone less senior, having to bring more paperwork than necessary, watching others get a nod while you get a checklist, providing proof of competence where others are simply trusted. The barriers were rarely shouted. They arrived quietly, but they arrived all the same. Standing in that bank lobby, Elias wasn't just facing Brennan. He was facing every silent barrier that had followed him throughout his career. It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. But it never stopped being exhausting. He thought of the countless black professionals who had walked into offices with their best work, their sharpest suits, their cleanest records, only to be asked for more, asked for explanations that others were never required to give. There's a name for this. It's called proving twice. Proving twice that you're qualified. Proving twice that you belong. Proving twice that you deserve to stand in the space you've already earned. It's not a single incident. It's a cycle that repeats in subtle ways. The unspoken doubt, when you're the only one in the room. The extra questions that follow your ideas but not your colleagues. The way a simple request is met with hesitation when you make it. For people who've lived it, this isn't theory. It's a daily calculation. Elias had carried this weight before, in meetings where his proposals were questioned until repeated by someone else. In negotiations where his numbers were checked, then checked again. And now, in this moment, in this bank, he was being asked once more to prove what was already in his hands. Brennan's final request came with a tone that barely hid his doubt. Perhaps he could provide a reference letter from another financial partner? It wasn't required. It wasn't listed. It wasn't standard. But it was asked. Elias paused. Not because he lacked the documents, but because he knew this wasn't about paperwork. It was about the silent barrier standing between him and the service that should have already been granted. Across the lobby, another customer was greeted with ease. No extra forms. No layers of proof. A handshake, a smile, and a smooth process. Elias had witnessed this contrast too many times to miss it now. The difference was always clear, even when it was unspoken. He had a choice, to keep stacking documents on the desk or to draw a line. For Elias, this wasn't just a credit inquiry anymore. It became a stand against the weight that black professionals carry in rooms where their presence is questioned before their ideas are heard. He straightened his shoulders, placed his phone on the desk, and made a quiet decision that would change the balance of power in that room. Have you ever had to prove yourself twice just to be taken seriously? Share your story in the comments. The exchange in the bank wasn't just about Elias and Brennan. It was part of something much older. The quiet resistance Elias faced was built on a long, unfinished story. Throughout history, black communities have fought for fair access to the financial system, often only to find the doors tightly controlled, the rules quietly shifted, or the promises stripped away. One of the clearest betrayals came in the late 1800s. After the Civil War, many newly freed black Americans placed their trust and their savings into the Freedmen's Bank. It was designed to help them build a future, a step toward stability after centuries of forced labor. But the bank collapsed not because of the people it was meant to serve, but because of those managing it. Tens of thousands of black families lost their savings. They lost not just money, but faith in the system meant to protect them. That loss wasn't just financial. It was personal. It was another reminder that security often sits just out of reach. Years passed, but the pattern didn't. When banks mapped cities in the 20th century, they used thick red lines to mark which neighborhoods were undesirable. These lines weren't about financial risk. They were about race. Whole communities were shut out of homeownership, credit, and opportunity. These marked neighborhoods, mostly black and brown communities, were systematically denied home loans, small business support, and basic financial services. Banks didn't just refuse mortgages. They refused growth. They refused stability. They refused futures. This wasn't ancient history. The effects still shape cities today. Some neighborhoods never recovered. Many still carry the weight of that exclusion. Lower property values, limited banking options, and fewer financial resources passed down to the next generation. The practice gained a name, redlining. It wasn't written in every policy, but it sat in decisions that push entire communities into long-term disadvantage. Even now, the echoes of those choices appear in new forms. Black mortgage applicants still face higher interest rates, even when their credit is strong. Black-owned businesses often face stricter loan conditions, even when the paperwork is perfect. And in banking halls like the one Elias entered, black customers are still more likely to be asked for extra verification, still more likely to have police called during ordinary transactions. Still more likely to face that quiet hesitation that says, "I don't believe you." It's not always visible, but it's there in policies and habits, in the small barriers that never seem to fall for everyone. What Elias faced that day wasn't isolated. It sat on top of generations of exclusion. The walls built in financial systems didn't just block black customers. They reached into the careers of black professionals who fought to climb those very walls. Inside banks, offices, and corporate towers, the doors often remain half open. Black professionals, especially black men, have long been underrepresented in leadership roles. The challenges aren't always formal. They don't always come in the form of a clear no. They arrive as being passed over for key projects, being excluded from decision-making spaces, being told they aren't quite the right fit without clear explanation. Black employees are asked to prove their worth through extra tasks, additional certifications, and higher levels of performance just to be considered equal. Some are mistaken for support staff, even when they were the title of director. Others find their ideas dismissed until a white colleague presents the same solution. These moments are not rare. They are part of the everyday struggle to claim space in environments where value is too often judged by something other than skill. The cost is more than lost opportunities. It affects mental health, personal confidence, and long-term career growth. Even when diversity programs are publicly promoted, those who push for real change sometimes find themselves isolated or pushed out. When leaders call for equity but do not enforce it, the cycle remains. And the weight falls back on the individuals who must fight battles the system should have already resolved. Public statements aren't enough. In recent years, some of the largest financial institutions have promised to address these gaps. They've launched diversity programs, pledged billions to support racial equity, and filled stages with powerful speeches about change. But for many black customers and employees, the lived experience remains the same. Banks continue to settle discrimination cases behind closed doors. In some branches, black customers are still met with suspicion, while others pass through with ease. In corporate offices, black professionals continue to face pay gaps, stalled promotions, and quiet exclusion from key opportunities. One example stands out. When a high-ranking diversity executive at a global financial firm pushed for black employee advancement, she was forced out. Her lawsuit exposed the gap between the promises made and the choices behind the boardroom doors. This is where the problem lives, not in slogans, but in the decisions that shape daily practice. Without accountability, policies mean little. Without leaders who act when bias appears, progress dissolves into empty statements. This is why Elias's story matters. The quiet obstacles he faced didn't begin with Brennan, and they wouldn't end there unless someone decided to stop letting them pass as normal. Elias carried more than his own frustration that day. He carried the weight of history, the sharp memory of broken promises, and the responsibility to push back in a way that couldn't be ignored. Elias had stood in enough rooms like this to know how easily he could have let this pass. He could have handed over more documents. He could have allowed Brennan to drag the process further, to hold his identity up for more silent inspection. He could have walked away, but he didn't. There comes a moment when continuing to carry the weight is no longer the right choice. Elias calmly placed his phone on the desk and tapped a familiar number. His voice remained steady. "Yes, I'm at Grand Horizon Central Branch. I'm speaking with a manager here." A short pause. He's made it clear he won't proceed. Brennan's posture didn't change. If anything, his confidence grew. The tone in Elias's voice wasn't loud, and that made Brennan even more certain he was dealing with just another difficult customer. "You can tell them whatever you like," Brennan said, stacking the papers as if to signal the conversation was ending. "We have protocols. There's a process. I can't just approve these things based on assumptions." Assumptions. That word hung in the air, its meaning sharp. Brennan leaned back, comfortable in his role. He'd seen customers make calls before. Calls to friends, calls to people they claimed would intervene. None of them had changed his decisions. "This is a high-level request," Brennan added, almost with amusement. "It'll take days, probably weeks. These matters are handled above me." Elias locked eyes with him. "That's exactly why I made the call." Brennan's confidence didn't waver. His mind was already filing this moment away as routine. His hands moved deliberately, setting Elias's documents aside with finality. He glanced toward the waiting customers, signaling to his colleagues that this would soon be over. But something shifted. The phone at the front desk rang. It was a direct line, one that rarely interrupted the flow of daily transactions. The receptionist's face tightened as she listened carefully. She looked across the room to Brennan. "They're asking for you." Immediately. Still, Brennan showed no urgency. He walked over, collected the phone, and answered with his usual authority. "This is Brennan. How can I help you?" What came through the line didn't just pull his attention. It stripped it. His back straightened. His fingers pressed against the edge of the counter. His mouth opened, but no words followed. He glanced toward Elias, not with irritation, not with casual dismissal, but with the first flicker of doubt. Yes, I understand," Brennan said, his voice now low and precise. "I didn't realize." He set the phone down, his hand lingering on it longer than necessary. He didn't move toward Elias. He didn't return to his desk. Instead, he stood still. The regional director's arrival was fast. Too fast for Brennan to control the pace of what followed. Within minutes, a suited executive entered the branch, his steps firm, his expression unreadable. Staff paused. Conversation slowed. A few customers quietly turned to watch. The executive's eyes scanned the room and landed directly on Elias. He walked over without hesitation. "Mr. Thorne, thank you for bringing this to our attention," he said, addressing Elias with a level of familiarity that silenced any lingering doubt. Brennan's breath caught. His eyes widened as the pieces quickly assembled themselves in his mind. The man he had just dismissed wasn't a minor client. Elias was a high-value partner, a respected CEO, a figure who had personal access to decision-makers far beyond Brennan's reach. The executive's attention turned to Brennan. His voice was calm but carried a weight that silenced the entire lobby. "You've just denied service to a valued client who holds influence within our broader financial network. His credentials were valid. His requests were appropriate. And your decisions were unacceptable." Brennan attempted to speak, but the executive continued without pause. "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a clear failure of judgment and a direct violation of our operational guidelines." The staff who had smirked earlier now avoided eye contact. The small comments, the whispers, the glances, they all sat uncomfortably in the air now, impossible to retract. "You are hereby dismissed from your position," the executive stated firmly, effective immediately. The words did not need to be repeated. Brennan's face flushed. His steady posture collapsed. His hands shook as he reached for the papers he had stacked so confidently just moments before. This was not the ending he had expected. This wasn't one of those days where the customer would simply walk away. The security team, previously unbothered by the exchange, now approached to ensure the dismissal was carried out without disruption. Brennan didn't argue. He knew there was no room left to explain. No second chance. As he collected his belongings, his eyes drifted back to Elias. But Elias's gaze didn't gloat. It remained steady, the same way it had throughout the entire exchange. The silence in the bank was heavy, not with chaos, but with realization. The man who had been dismissed, the man who had been challenged, the man who had been pushed to prove himself again and again, had always held the power. The only question now was whether those watching would remember the lesson. Respect is not optional, and silence when witnessing injustice is never neutral. The atmosphere inside the bank had changed. The easy confidence that once filled the room was gone, replaced by a focused silence that wrapped around every person present. The regional executive, Mr. Langford, moved with purpose. He wasn't here to soften the situation or offer polite explanations. His attention stayed fixed on Brennan, who now looked visibly unsettled. "Let's be clear," Langford began, his voice steady but sharp. Mr. Thorne's documentation was never in question. "The problem isn't paperwork. The problem is your conduct." Brennan fumbled for a response. "I was just following procedure." Langford didn't allow the excuse to land. "You processed similar requests before, but this time you created barriers that weren't required." "Why?" Brennan's eyes darted to the surrounding staff, but no one stepped forward to support him. The earlier whispers and smirks had vanished. Langford turned to the customer service desk. Pull today's transaction log. I want a record of every large withdrawal processed this morning. Compare the steps you require from Mr. Thorne to what you ask from others. A junior associate quickly printed the records. Langford reviewed them carefully, his expression unchanged. You processed 3 large withdrawals today. None of those customers were asked for extra identification, revenue statements, or secondary verification. Only Mr. Thorne was treated this way. The evidence was clear. Langford continued, "This isn't just about one incident. It speaks to a larger issue, a pattern we cannot ignore." Brennan's words grew desperate. "It wasn't personal. I was just trying to be careful." Langford set the paperwork down and looked Brennan directly in the eye. Careful is asking everyone the same questions. Careful is following policy without bias. What you demonstrated here was selective obstruction. Elias stood quietly, his composure unchanged. Langford faced him. "Mr. Thorne, we deeply regret this experience. It does not reflect the values we claim to hold." Elias offered a slight nod. Values are tested in the small moments. Not when you're watching, but when you're not. Langford absorbed those words. There was nothing more to say. Action was required. Effective immediately, Brennan is no longer employed by this bank, Langford announced. His decision, his language, and his conduct today were unacceptable. The security team approached, now positioned to ensure Brennan's departure. Brennan didn't resist. He simply gathered his things with trembling hands. The authority he had carried so confidently earlier had vanished. As Brennan was escorted toward the back office, Langford addressed the remaining staff. His words were not rushed. Each one landed with weight. "This is not an isolated correction," he said. "We will be reviewing conduct in this branch. Every decision, every interaction, every complaint that was ignored or dismissed. You will no longer get to decide whose business is welcome here based on your assumptions." The staff lowered their eyes. The message was clear. Langford stepped toward Elias again. "Your call went directly to our senior office. Your position was recognized immediately, but I know you didn't make that call just for yourself." Elias's response was calm, firm. "I made it for the countless people who walk into places like this every day and walk out without being heard." His tone wasn't filled with anger. It was focused. He wasn't here for personal satisfaction. He was here because the silence has a cost. "Many of them don't have the option I had today." Elias continued. "They can't make a direct call. They can't trigger this kind of response. And the fact that they can is exactly why I chose not to let this pass." Langford stood still, the weight of that truth sitting between them. The customers in the lobby, who had witnessed the entire exchange, stood in quiet respect. Some nodded subtly. Some watched with new awareness. They had seen not just a confrontation, but a correction. Elias understood the power he carried. But he also understood that power isn't just about having authority. It's about choosing when to use it, and why. He could have demanded more. He could have insisted on harsher penalties. But instead, he exercised his influence with precision. Firm, measured, clear. The staff who had contributed to the earlier atmosphere, those who had smirked, those who had whispered, now felt the weight of their silence. Langford didn't need to remind them. The entire sequence of events had already served as a lesson. When leaders respond quickly, when they act publicly, when they hold people accountable without delay, it sends a message that sticks. Elias turned toward the security desk where his supervisor now stood, having quietly observed the entire process. People often talk about diversity and inclusion as though they are side programs, Elias said. But respect is not a program. It is a standard. And when it's not upheld, there should be no hesitation to act. The security supervisor nodded, recognizing the deeper meaning. Elias collected his documents, still fully composed. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't issued threats. He had simply made a call, answered a challenge, and left no room for excuses. Langford followed him to the door. "Thank you for standing firm," Langford said. "It's easy to look away. You didn't." Elias paused, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "I didn't stand for myself," he said. "I stood for the people who don't get called back, for the people who leave quietly." for the ones who carry this weight every day and still show up. Langford's response was quiet. We have work to do. Yes, Elias replied. You do. With that, he stepped out of the branch, his stride steady, his decision unchanged. The story wouldn't end with a simple termination. This would become a reference point, a turning moment that other employees in that bank will remember when choosing how to treat the next person who walked through their doors. Leadership isn't proven in titles. It's proven in moments like this. If you believe that leadership must stand up to injustice, hit the subscribe button now. Let this story remind us all, power is not about who speaks the loudest. It's about who uses their voice when it matters most. What happened at Grand Horizon Bank wasn't just about Brennan's behavior. It wasn't about one manager making a poor decision. It was about a structure, a system, that quietly allowed these moments to happen over and over again. This was never just one conversation. It was a result of years of unchecked bias moving through hiring, training, and everyday decision-making. It's easy to point to one person and say, the problem is gone. It's harder to ask, how did the problem live here for so long? That's the deeper fight. The injustice Elias faced isn't rare. It follows Black professionals into offices, into banks, into corporate meetings, into hiring rooms, and into promotion discussions. It shows up when natural hair is labeled as unprofessional or when leadership defines polish, using standards that quietly erase Black identity. This is why laws like the Crown Act were introduced, to protect Black employees from discrimination based on natural hairstyles. That such a law is even necessary speaks volumes. There's also the issue of pay. Studies have repeatedly shown that Black professionals are often paid less than their white peers for performing the same roles. The difference isn't minor. It stretches over careers and contributes directly to the racial wealth gap. Then there's the weight of microaggressions. Having your judgment questioned when others are accepted at face value. Being asked to explain your qualifications again and again. Watching your contributions go unrecognized until repeated by someone else. These aren't dramatic moments. They're the quiet, persistent forms of exclusion that wear people down. Elias's stand matters because it broke that pattern. It didn't just challenge one individual. It challenged the comfort of a system that's often left unbothered. Big banks know these problems exist. The industry has seen public lawsuits and multimillion-dollar settlements tied directly to discriminatory practices. One of the largest cases involved J.P. Morgan Chase. They were held accountable for sidelining Black financial advisors, cutting them off from key networks, and limiting their career growth. The company settled for $19.5 million, but the damage to trust was harder to repair. The lesson was clear. Without strong internal accountability, public promises mean nothing. What Elias did force accountability to happen immediately. He didn't wait for a formal complaint process to run its slow course. He didn't wait for time to smooth it over. His calm action pushed the system to confront itself right there, in front of everyone. It's easy to believe that change happens at the top in boardrooms or with policy revisions. But Elias's story shows something different. Change begins when someone refuses to carry the extra weight one more time. His decision sent a clear signal to that branch, to that bank, and to those who witnessed the moment. These small injustices are not small at all. They form a foundation of larger patterns that can no longer go unchecked. This wasn't just about service. It was about the conditions under which Black professionals are expected to endure and the importance of refusing that quiet expectation. Elias didn't leave that day thinking the story was over. For him, the goal was never to make headlines. It was to open a path others could walk more freely. The bank knew the public wouldn't forget what had happened. Leadership took quick steps to confront what had been exposed. The first change was local. Grand Horizon's regional office launched an internal review of the branch's practices. But Elias's story reached beyond that building. His experience was written into training materials across the company, not as a warning to staff, but as a real example of what unchecked bias looks like in practice. New employees would now hear his story on their first day. They would sit in rooms where this incident was not softened, not edited. They would be asked to face the question, what would you have done if you had been standing there? The story became a teaching tool. It forced people to reflect not only on their actions, but on their silence. Across the company, new guidelines were introduced to close the gaps Elias had exposed. Procedures were rewritten to limit the kind of discretion that allowed Brennan's bias to shape the outcome. Every large transaction now followed a strict checklist, one that applied equally to every customer. The bank's leadership also began hosting quarterly equity reviews, not as a formality, but as a priority. Customer experiences were reviewed by demographic data, and discrepancies were addressed openly. The bank didn't get to quietly repair its image. Elias's story stayed in the training rooms, in leadership briefings, and in the culture long after the day had passed. But Elias's impact wasn't just about policy. It was about the quiet power of dignity, the way Black professionals carry themselves through adversity, choosing not to be consumed by the harm inflicted upon them. There's a name for this quiet power: Black joy. Black joy isn't the absence of struggle. It's a decision to find pride, growth, and peace despite that struggle. It's building something real while walking through spaces that try to tell you don't belong. Elias's calm response was a model of that joy. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to prove his worth to Brennan or to anyone else in that room. His leadership came through steady action. His story now stands as a reminder that resistance doesn't always have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it's a quiet, decisive moment that shifts the entire room. The change didn't stop at Grand Horizon. Other branches across the region began adopting the new equity practices. Other managers began reviewing their own teams more carefully. That's the power of a single decision. When one person resists quietly but firmly, others are forced to stop and think. What Elias left behind was not just a corrected transaction. It was a cultural imprint. His story became part of the company's language. It challenged their assumptions. It reminded them that respect is not conditional. Some stories are loud. They move fast. They spread quickly. They burn bright. But there's another kind of story, the kind that grows slowly inside people, the kind that makes them stop, remember, and rethink what they've accepted as normal. Elias's story is that kind. It's not just about walking into a bank. It's not just about making a phone call. It's about knowing when to stop carrying the burden quietly. Sometimes injustice doesn't roar. Sometimes it speaks softly in the form of extra paperwork, delayed service, or a doubting glance. The power lies in recognizing that even the small barriers matter. They add up. They form patterns. They shape lives. The choice to push back, especially when it's easier to let it pass, is what real leadership looks like. Standing firm isn't always comfortable. It may not bring applause, but it changes something. It interrupts the pattern. It creates a new expectation. It forces the people who are watching, those who stay silent, those who smirk, those who enforce the unfair rules, to reconsider their place in that system. You may never know who's watching when you choose to stand your ground, but they are there, and your choice may be the moment that helps them see clearly for the first time. If you've ever faced subtle injustice, if you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever been asked to prove yourself twice just to be taken seriously, let this story remind you your presence is power. Comment, "My story matters" below. Subscribe for more, and share this story so others can learn from Elias's journey. Your voice is part of the change. Your story holds weight, and your refusal to carry the quiet burden alone may inspire someone else to stand.